but since Easter, I have been looking for a comfortable place. I'm tired of the physical and emotional and spiritual exertion of walking with Jesus to the cross, and then getting Jesus raised again. And don't get me wrong, it was wonderful to have 120-some people in worship on Easter Sunday. But knowing that we've now got to move on into stewardship season and prepare for the annual meeting and dealing with the seasonal allergies that have beset me this weekend, I've been looking for the literal and emotional equivalent of mashed potatoes and sweatpants. I have been looking for, yearning for time to lay down on the couch and fill in the boxes of Sudoku puzzles while pretending to watch reruns of Matlock. And I have to wonder, it sounds like from your connection with laughter, perhaps you know what it's like to be in that place as well. And I have to wonder if poor old Peter was not also in that place too. After the events of Easter, we find him back where Jesus first found him, by the lake shore fishing. Peter went back to his comfort zone. He went back to the familiar sights and smells of his earlier days, when the white sands of the shoreline squished up between his toes, and the water gently lapped up on the sides of the boat, and the wind burned his cheek, and the putrid smell of fish filled his lungs. It may be that Peter just needed a breather to get away from it all and ponder everything that had just happened. After all, it's not every day that your spiritual leader is killed and then feels present again in a way that is even more real than before, at least to those with open hearts. But reading between the lines of John's gospel story, I have a sense that there is more than just physical and emotional exhaustion going on for Peter. Peter, it seems to me, is trying to come to grips with who he is, or at least who he perceives himself to be. He was, by all accounts, a leader of the band that had surrounded Jesus. He was a rebel of sorts, both by temperament and by calling. He'd given up the financial and emotional security of being a successful fisherman on this very lake. And apparently, he had done it gladly. He even saw himself as a hero of sorts, I think. A regular John Wayne kind of guy, helping Jesus fight evil, and imagining the two of them riding off into the sunset together someday. But when push came to shove, Peter caved. When Peter realized that Jesus was actually willing to put his life on the line in his quest to live out the depth of God's love, Peter let fear get the best of him. And I have a lot of empathy for Peter in that regard. And it all came to a head, you might remember, around a charcoal fire. Around a charcoal fire, not unlike the one in today's gospel reading by the lake shore. But this charcoal fire was outside in the governor's courtyard on the night of Jesus' arrest. While Jesus was inside the governor's house being interrogated, you may remember that Peter, outside in the courtyard, faced an interrogation of his own. Aren't you one of those rebel-rousers who followed Jesus? One of the governor's guards asked Peter. Who? Me? Peter said, snorting. Nah, you must have me mixed up with some other good-looking guy. And then he whipped out his chew and tried to act natural. 3 times the guard asked him the same question. And 3 times Peter denied even knowing who Jesus was. And at that very moment, the artful storyteller John tells us, a rooster crowed, and something inside Peter died. Some image of himself as a decent, loyal, and capable person died in the ashes of that charcoal fire that night. So, I'll tell you what I think Peter was doing back at the lake in that fishing boat with his old buddies. I think he was beating up on himself. I think he was trying to forget how embarrassed he felt. I think he was trying not to think about what a failure he now perceived himself to be. I think he was trying to recover an image of himself from an earlier time in his life when he didn't feel like such a fake. Does that ever sound familiar to you? Happens all the time, doesn't it? We've all been with Peter at one time or another in our lives. We do something shameful or embarrassing, cowardly or stupid. Something which causes us to question the image that we have of ourselves as a basically good and competent and trustworthy person. And we long for the comfort of the couch and the sweatpants and the mashed potatoes. I can totally empathize with the words of the refreshingly honest and unbridled Anne Lamott in an essay of hers that I read recently. You may have read one of her several wonderful books. And I think that Jesus' disciple Peter would empathize with Anne's reflections here as well. Here's how I became myself, she writes. Mess, failure, mistakes, disappointment, and extensive reading. Limbo, indecision, setbacks, addiction, personal embarrassment, public embarrassment, and endless conversations with my best women friends. The loss of people without whom I could not live. The loss of pets that left me reeling. Dizzying betrayals, but much greater loyalty. And overall, choosing as my motto William Blake's line, that we are all here to learn to endure the beams of love. We are all here to learn to endure the beams of love. Oh yeah, she writes, and whenever I could, for as long as I could, I threw away the scales and the sugar. For me, Lamott is suggesting that the pathway to self-forgiveness and resurrection begins with an acknowledgement that the path is the path. Where we are is where we are. It may not be pretty, it may not be noble, but we have no power to change the past. But what we do have within our grasp is where we might go next. In the words of John Lewis, we have a choice about where we live. As you may know, John Lewis is an African-American U.S. congressman from Georgia. You may not also know that Lewis was a founding member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and in his early 20s, he walked with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. across the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. He was labeled by the mayor of Selma at that time as one of the most dangerous men in America, simply because he called attention to the oppression of his own people. His pursuit of Isaiah's vision of justice and of the American dream garnered him numerous beatings and jailings. During a presentation many years later, Lewis was asked, "Considering the prejudice you have lived through, what has kept you from living in bitterness?" And Lewis responded, "There comes a time when you must have an executive session with yourself regarding from where you will live. My life is also informed by the changes I've seen. Is all well racially in America? No. And yet, I have recently been invited by the same mayor of Selma to return to that city as an honored guest. I have seen changes in towns across the country, and I must now decide from where I will live. I have no idea what motives were behind the invitation of the Selma mayor, who had been that mayor 50 years ago. Whether it was political expediency or genuine conversion to invite John Lewis back. But for John Lewis, it was an internal invitation to choose where he would live. He could live in the world of past discrimination, or he could give the mayor another chance to show himself a changed man, at least in his public life, if not in his heart. And John chose to live in a world that was moving forward and not back. Jesus gave Peter that same chance. He was aware of Peter's past and present failings. But what Jesus wanted to know was whether Peter was still desirous of their relationship. So Jesus stood with Peter by a charcoal fire and took the place of the questioning guard from years back, or months back. In a back-to-the-future moment, Jesus asked Peter 3 times if he loved him. And 3 painful times, Peter answered that indeed he did. And then Jesus offered Peter a transformative invitation. Then let me see where you will live from, Jesus seems to be saying. Peter, feed my sheep. Like John Lewis, Jesus was giving Peter the chance to be the person he knew he could be all along. Indeed, the person that Jesus knew Peter was all along. And the good news of resurrection is that Jesus comes to each of us also, again and again and again, and stands with us by our charcoal fires of failure and shame, and says to us, I know that you are someone different than you think you are at this very moment. No matter who you think you are, I know you to be a beloved child of God, and fully capable of living that way, fully capable of loving yourself and loving all those around you. And while you're moping around in the middle of your own mess, I will keep reminding you that you are loved and capable of love until you choose to settle down and live there. For as the poet William Blake has reminded us, we are all here to endure the beams of love. Thanks be for that gift. Amen.